The man sat encased in the silent luxury of a Gulfstream G650, a silver needle piercing the thin, frozen air at 41,000 feet. To any observer, he was the portrait of contemporary power, tailored charcoal wool, a watch that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and a posture that suggested a man used to commanding both markets and people. He stared out the window, but he wasn't looking at the clouds. He was looking at his own reflection, a pale ghost superimposed over the vast, empty blue of the Atlantic. Below him, the ocean appeared as a static, unmoving sheet of cobalt, devoid of life or motion. From this height, the world was sanitized, reduced to a series of coordinates on a digital flight path. There was no smell of salt here, no roar of the wind, only the filtered, recycled air of a cabin that smelled faintly of expensive leather and cleaning solvent. His life had become a series of these sterile containers, limousines, boardrooms, penthouses, each one designed to insulate him from the friction of reality. His thumb moved mechanically across the glass surface of a tablet. It was a reflex, a digital heartbeat. Each swipe dismissed a crisis, each tap authorized a fortune. Yet the more he controlled, the less he felt. There was a persistent, hollow ache in his chest, a sensation of being untethered. He was traveling toward a private island, a paradise bought and paid for, a place where even the palm trees were lightly pruned to aesthetic perfection. He was fleeing a world he had built, only to realize he was carrying the blueprints of his own prison with him. The scotch in his glass remained untouched. The ice had melted long ago, diluting the amber liquid until it looked as pale and thin as his own sense of purpose. He felt the jet tilt slightly, a minor course correction dictated by a computer in a language he didn't speak. He was a passenger in his own existence, hurtling toward a destination that promised relaxation, but offered only a different kind of silence. The change began not with a sound, but with a distortion of light. The horizon, once a sharp line between sea and sky, began to blur and warp, as if the atmosphere was melting. Great towering clouds rose up like the white marble pillars of a forgotten temple, but their bellies were bruised with a sickly, electric green. The jet, usually so stable, began to shudder. It wasn't the rhythmic bouncing of common turbulence. It was a violent, erratic heaving, as if the aircraft had flown into the grip of a giant, invisible hand. He gripped the armrests, his knuckles whitening. The digital displays around him began to fail. The flight map flickered, the red line of his progress toward the resort dissolving into a chaotic swarm of pixels. The cabin lights pulsed, bright, then dim, then a terrifying absolute black. In that darkness, the silence was more violent than any noise. The engines seemed to vanish, replaced by a low-frequency thrum that vibrated not in his ears but in his marrow. Outside the window, the world was no longer blue. It was a kaleidoscope of storm and shadow. Lightning didn't strike. It crawled across the clouds like glowing veins. He felt a sudden, sickening sensation of weightlessness, followed by a crushing G-force that pinned him into his seat. The pressurized cabin groaned, the sound of metal under extreme stress screaming like a living thing. Then came the smell. It defied the laws of aviation. The scent of ozone and jet fuel was suddenly overwhelmed by something primal, the stench of brine, the heavy musk of tropical decay, and the sharp, acrid bite of wood smoke. It was the smell of the earth before it had been paved over, a raw and ancient odor that filled his lungs and made his head swim. The very air felt thicker, heavier, saturated with a humidity that the jet's climate control could never have produced. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the world had rearranged itself. The sleek, curved walls of the cabin were gone. The leather seat had vanished, replaced by a rough-hewn wooden bench that bit into his thighs. The soft, ambient LED lighting was a memory. In its place, the flickering, smoky orange glow of a tallow candle cast long, dancing shadows against walls made of dark, salt-crusted oak. He was no longer in a machine. He was inside an organism, a wooden hull that groaned and sighed with every roll of the sea. The ceiling was low, heavy with beams that dripped with condensation and pitch. The air was thick with the sound of the ocean, but it was no longer a distant whisper. It was a roar, a rhythmic pounding of water against wood that felt intimate and threatening. He looked down at his clothes. The charcoal wool had been replaced by a heavy, damp fabric, coarse linen and wool that felt abrasive against his skin. His hands, once soft and manicured, were stained with tar and dirt. The watch was gone, leaving only a pale strip of skin on his wrist, a ghostly reminder of a time that no longer existed. He felt a strange lightness in his pockets, the phone, the keys, the wallet. The entire kit of his modern identity had been stripped away. The motion of the vessel was deep and nauseating. It was a slow, majestic heaving that spoke of immense weight and the power of the swells. He realized then that he wasn't just in a different place. He was in a different era. The silence of the jet had been replaced by a symphony of friction, the snap of canvas, the groan of hemp ropes, and the distant, muffled shouting of men in a language that sounded like English but carried a rhythm and a roughness he didn't recognize. The ship finally came to rest, the violent motion settling into a gentle, mocking sway. A heavy door at the end of the cramped cabin swung open, and for a moment the man was blinded. The sun was an assault, a white-hot, punishing glare that felt like a physical weight. As his eyes adjusted, the reality of his vacation dissolved into a nightmare of historical proportions. He stepped out onto a deck that was a hive of frantic, brutal activity. This was not the pristine harbor of a luxury resort. This was a forest of masts, a tangled web of rigging and tattered black and red flags. The air was a thick soup of smells, the sweetness of rotting fruit, the tang of iron, the charcoal scent of roasted meat, and the overwhelming, sour stench of unwashed bodies and cheap, fermented sugar. Before him lay a crescent of land that seemed to pulse with a dangerous, chaotic energy. It was a settlement built of driftwood, scavenged ship parts, and mud. Tortuga. The name echoed in his mind, not as a historical footnote, but as a living, breathing entity. There were no paved roads, no glass towers, no security guards. There were only men and women moving with the desperate, jagged intensity of those who lived every hour as if it were their last. He stood on the sun-bleached planks of the dock, a ghost from the future standing in the heart of a violent past. The people around him ignored him, or perhaps they saw him as just another soul spat out by the sea, another piece of debris to be used or discarded. He looked at the horizon, the same horizon he had seen from the jet, but now it was terrifyingly vast. There was no rescue coming. There was no return button. For the first time in his life, the man was truly alone, stripped of his titles and his technology. He was a blank slate in a world of predators. As he took his first step onto the burning sand of the island, he felt a strange, terrifying spark of something he hadn't felt in decades, the raw, unadulterated instinct to survive. The modern world was dead. Tortuga was waiting. The heat in Tortuga was not a weather condition. It was a physical entity that sat on the man's shoulders like a leaden cloak. As he moved away from the docks, the ground transitioned from sun-bleached timber to a treacherous mix of black volcanic sand and packed mud, slick, with the offal of a town that had no sewer system but the tide. Every step was a negotiation with the earth. The air here was thicker than the pressurized oxygen of the jet. It was a humid soup of wood smoke, unrefined sugar, and the metallic tang of dried blood. He walked through a labyrinth of lean-tos and shacks constructed from the ribs of broken ships. These were architectural skeletons, held together by tar and desperation. He saw men with skin the color of old mahogany, their bodies mapped with the white lightning streaks of whip scars and the jagged craters of musket balls. They didn't look like the romanticized rebels of cinema. They looked like exhausted animals. their eyes bright with a feverish, predatory alertness. There was no customer service here. No one came to guide him. He watched a group of sailors hauling a massive cask of rum up a muddy incline, their muscles straining against the hemp ropes until the fibers screamed. One man slipped, his leg catching beneath the rolling weight. The sound of the bones snapping was sharp, like a dry branch in winter, but the work didn't stop. The others simply stepped over him, their faces set in a mask of grim indifference. In this world, the man realized, a human life was a depreciating asset, valued only as long as it could pull an oar or swing a blade. He felt his own soft, manicured hands throbbing. The salt in the air was already beginning to chap his skin, turning his palms into a map of raw, red irritation. He was a creature of glass and silicon, suddenly thrust into a world of iron and oak. The realization was a cold stone in his gut. His wealth, his connections, and his strategic vision were worth less than a single gallon of fresh water in this place. By midday, he found himself in the heart of the settlement, a plaza dominated by a massive, gnarled banyan tree whose roots seemed to be strangling the very earth. Beneath its shade, the commerce of Tortuga took place. This was the dark mirror of the stock exchange he had left behind. There were no tickers, no fiber-optic cables, only the heavy, physical presence of plunder. He watched as crates of indigo, bales of tobacco, and shimmering piles of silk were traded for powder, shot, and jars of medicinal bark. The currency was heavy, Spanish doubloons and silver pieces of 8 that made a dull, thudding sound when dropped onto the counting tables. There was no credit here, no faith in future earnings. Value was something you could hold in your hand, something that had weight and edge. He observed the brethren of the coast moving through the plaza. They walked with a swagger that was both arrogant and fragile. They were men who had rejected the laws of kings only to bind themselves to a far more brutal code of their own making. He saw a man being forced to sign a Chasse-Partie, a pirate contract. There was no fine print, no legal jargon. It was a simple, terrifying accounting of risk. No prey, no pay. Loss of a limb was worth a set amount of silver. Death was a line item. As he watched, he felt the internal structures of his own mind beginning to crack. His entire life had been built on the idea of mitigating risk. He had insurance, lawyers, and safety nets. But here, risk was the only constant. These men didn't mitigate it. They wore it like a badge of honor. They lived in the permanent present tense, a state of being that was both terrifying and, in a strange, dark way, liberating. The man felt a flicker of envy for their clarity, even as he recoiled from their cruelty. As evening fell, the man retreated to the edge of the settlement, seeking the relative silence of the shoreline. The sky turned a violent shade of violet, reflecting in the water of the bay until the world seemed to be made of bruises. He sat on a piece of driftwood, staring out at the dark silhouettes of the ships at anchor. In the silence, the introspection he had been fleeing in his modern life finally caught up to him. Without the constant hum of his phone or the demands of his schedule, his thoughts were loud and unforgiving. He realized that the freedom he had sought in his executive life was a lie. He had been a servant to his own success, a prisoner of a different kind of code, one involving quarterly growth and brand perception. He looked at his reflection in a pool of trapped seawater. The face looking back was gaunt, the eyes sunken and wide. He saw the transition happening in real time. The executive was dying, stripped away by the salt and the sun. What was left? A man who knew how to balance a spreadsheet but didn't know how to start a fire. A man who could lead 1,000 employees but couldn't defend himself against a single hungry thief. The ocean before him was a vast, indifferent mirror. It didn't care about his pedigree or his net worth. It only recognized strength and the will to endure. He felt a profound sense of grief for the life he had lost, but also a burgeoning, primal curiosity. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about where he would be in 5 years. He was thinking about how he would survive the next 5 minutes. The truth of himself was no longer a philosophical question. It was a physical necessity. Driven by hunger and the need for shelter, he was forced back into the town as the night deepened. The darkness in Tortuga was absolute, broken only by the orange flare of torches and the glow of tavern windows. The air was now thick with the sound of the great leveler, rum. He entered a tavern that was little more than a roof supported by rotting posts. The interior was a haze of smoke and sweat. He saw men who had been enemies hours ago now drinking together, bound by the shared knowledge that they might all be dead by the next moon. There was an honesty in their debauchery that chilled him. They weren't pretending to be good or civilized. They had embraced the darkness within themselves and turned it into a way of life. He found a corner, a shadow among shadows. He watched a captain, a man with an eye patch that wasn't a costume but a jagged scar, distributing a chest of gold. The captain didn't take the lion's share. He took only what the code allowed. In this den of thieves, there was a perverted sense of justice that was more rigid than any corporate HR policy he had ever encountered. He realized then that he was at a crossroads. He could remain a victim at this time, a terrifying ghost wandering the docks until he faded away. Or he could adapt. He could use the same ruthlessness that had made him a titan of industry and apply it to this new, bloodier landscape. As he watched a pirate sharpen a dagger in the dim light, the man felt his fingers twitch. His mind began to calculate, not in dollars and cents, but in leverage and survival. The transformation was nearly complete. He was no longer a tourist in the past. He was a recruit of the storm. Weeks had bled into a single, salt-stained blur. The man stood on the tilting deck of a scavenger sloop, his hands no longer the soft, pale tools of a typist. They were mapped with thick, yellowed calluses and stained permanently with the black grease of the cannons. His tailored suit was a ghost. He now wore a heavy coat of oiled canvas and boots that smelled of shark oil and wood smoke. He had learned the language of the ship, not the digital telemetry of a cockpit, but the groans of the hull that signaled a coming squall and the subtle shift in the vibration of the deck that warned of a shifting sandbar. He was no longer a spectator. He had been forced into the brutal communal labor of the crew. He had spent hours suspended in a bosun's chair, stitching ripped canvas while the sea churned 50 feet below his dangling boots. He had hauled on the great lines until his muscles screamed and his vision went red. In this labor, he found a terrifying clarity. In his former life, work was an abstraction, emails sent into a void, meetings that resulted in more meetings. Here, work was survival. If the knot slipped, the mast snapped. If the mast snapped, everyone died. He watched the horizon with a new kind of intensity. He wasn't looking for a resort or a rescue plane. He was looking for the smudge of a sail, the specific shade of white that indicated a Spanish merchantman laden with silver. He felt a dark, electric thrill at the prospect of the hunt. The strategic acquisitions of his past felt like children's games compared to the raw, high-stakes gambling and chase at sea. He was learning that his mind, the analytical, cold-blooded machine that had conquered markets, was perfectly suited for the tactical carnage of the Caribbean. The true test came in the form of a late-season hurricane that turned the Caribbean into a churning cauldron of gray foam and obsidian water. The ship was caught in the eye of the beast, a place where the laws of physics seemed to dissolve. The captain had been swept overboard in the first hour, a sudden, silent disappearance that left the crew leaderless and paralyzed by the sheer scale of the destruction. In that moment of absolute chaos, the man felt the old executive rise up within him, but it was forged in a new fire. He didn't deliberate. He didn't form a committee. He stepped into the vacuum of power. He moved across the slick, treacherous deck with a grace he didn't know he possessed, grabbing a panicked sailor by the throat and pointing toward the mainsail. He didn't need words. His eyes carried the weight of an iron command. He took the wheel himself. The kick of the rudder was like the pulse of a living creature, a wild horse trying to break his arms. He felt the immense pressure of the ocean trying to pivot the ship into the trough of a wave, where it would be crushed like an eggshell. He steered by instinct, feeling the rhythm of the swells, timing the rises and falls with a precision that surpassed any computer algorithm. For hours, he was the only thing standing between the crew and the abyss. He wasn't thinking about his bank account, his legacy, or his lost life. He was thinking about the tension in the ropes and the angle of the bow. He was, for the first time in his existence, completely present. The storm was his mirror, reflecting back a man who was no longer afraid of the dark because he had become a part of it. When the storm finally broke, the world was reborn in a haunting, crystalline stillness. The ship was a wreck, masts splintered, sails tattered into ribbons, but it was afloat. The crew lay on the deck, exhausted and broken, looking up at the man at the wheel with a mixture of fear and reverence. He had led them through the mouth of hell, and he had brought them out the other side. The man walked to the rail and looked down into the mirror-flat water. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a long, golden path across the sea. He saw his reflection, and he didn't recognize the person looking back. The eyes were hard, the skin scorched by the sun, the beard matted with salt. This was a man who had seen the bottom of the world and decided to climb back up. He felt a strange, phantom vibration in his pocket. It was the memory of a phone, a ghost of the digital tether that had once defined him. He realized that if a modern rescue ship appeared on the horizon at that very moment, he wouldn't know how to step back onto it. The civilized world felt like a dream, a loud, crowded, and ultimately meaningless dream. The freedom he had found on this lawless island was a heavy, bloody thing, but it was real. He understood now the true nature of the pirate code. It wasn't about theft or rebellion. It was about the sovereignty of the individual in the face of an indifferent universe. He had spent his life building walls to protect himself from the world, only to realize that the walls were what was suffocating him. Out here, with nothing but the wood beneath his feet and the steel at his hip, he was finally, terrifyingly free. The ship limped back toward Tortuga, but the man knew he was no longer a guest. He was a predator returning to his den. As the island appeared on the horizon, glowing like an emerald in the morning light, he felt a profound sense of homecoming. The resort, the private jet, the boardrooms, they were the artifacts of a dead man. He stood on the bow, his hand resting on the hilt of a cutlass that remained from the ship's armory. He thought about the person who had boarded that plane weeks ago. That man was a ghost, a shell filled with anxieties and false goals. This new man, the captain of the wreck, was filled with a dark, cold clarity. He was a man who chose the storm over the cage. The truth he had sought through introspection wasn't a philosophical realization. It was a physical transformation. He had discovered that beneath the layers of luxury and technology, there was a core of iron. He didn't need the world to tell him he was successful. He knew he was alive because he could feel the pulse of the ocean in his veins. As the anchor dropped in the harbor of Tortuga, the man looked at the sky. There were no satellites, no signals, no noise, just the vast blue silence. He turned away from the horizon and looked toward the shore where the fires were already burning and the rum was already flowing. He took a deep breath of the salt and the smoke, closed his eyes and stepped into his new life. The journey was over. The pirate had come home.